Well, for some of you who have been around Rosewood for a few years, well, I don't want to be rude, but actually many, many years, you will know the name Arnold Reimer. Arnold Reimer was an Alliance pastor here in Canada, pastored Rosewood many years ago. And when I left the Lutheran Church and joined the Alliance denomination, Arnold was the district superintendent here in our district. Really appreciated the guy, felt he was such a mentor to me. But when he was pastoring in Ontario, he actually pastored the church where A.W. Tozer pastored. And they bought some land in a new area of Toronto, and they were going to build a church. And there was about 250 people in the church at that time. And they wanted to build a church for $2 million. And you say, well, $2 million, that's not bad. Except that in today's dollars, it would be $11 million. And this church of 250 wanted to borrow that much money. As you might not be surprised, at every level that they went through in the bank, they were declined. They wouldn't give them any money. So finally, Arnold and the then president of the Alliance asked to meet with the vice president. And one of the vice presidents called him and said, I can meet with you. I can give you only 10 minutes. But they went. And so the vice president barely even spoke to them, didn't welcome them, introduce himself. Just basically sat down and he said, what makes you think that a church your size can pay off a $2 million loan? And Arnold says, if you knew Arnold, you would see him saying this. I can picture him saying it. He said, sir, you insult my God. And the VP actually, because it was the president telling me all this, actually kind of shook and sat back and said, well, what do you mean? And so Arnold went on to tell him about God and his miracles and his guidance and his direction and the importance of his people obeying him. And one of the things that he said to him was that God honors faith and risk. And so for the first time in the history of that bank, they loaned a church $2 million. And it was paid back far ahead of schedule. And that church, which is now called Bayview Glen, at one time was probably one of the largest churches in Canada, but is now still a very, very large church. The people of Bayview Glen were well aware of what they were taking on. They had talked about it. They had prayed about it. It had been a few-year process. But they believed that this is what God was calling them to do. Arnold believed that. The elders believed that. The church believed that. And if you've ever been in a building program, you know it's unusual to have a congregation saying, yeah, let's borrow $2 million, can't wait. And they felt this is what they were called to do. Now, one thing they knew, though, is that they were going to face barriers. There was going to be issues that came up, things that needed to be dealt with and needed to be resolved. God had given them a vision. But let me tell you this right now, and you probably already know it. It is never easy to accomplish God's vision. To be honest with you, if it's easy, it's probably not God's vision. Because God's vision is something big that actually kind of scares you when you get into it. I was saved in a church here in Regina. Our attendance was about, 170, 180 at that time. And we were having a summer camp. And we said, okay, let's get it for 200 because we were advertising it across Western Canada. Let's get it for 200. And as the elders were praying, our elders, believe it or not, met every week, every Thursday morning from 6:30 to 8 o'clock. And we were praying about this one time, and one of the elders said, guys, I know this is crazy, but I think we need to find a location that will hold 350 people, double the size of our congregation. And so the rest of the elders said what we often say in that situation, get behind me, Satan. But we felt, you know what? This sits well in our spirit. So we rented a place, 300 people. You know how many people showed up? 285. For a congregation of 140 some or 50 some. That wasn't easy. Just to rent it alone scared us because of the cost. And we didn't charge anything for the camp. You just gave what you could. That was not easy. We were scared. We were actually thinking this is how much faith we had. Okay, when we lose money on this, how are we going to pay it back? God's vision is never, ever easy. And in the book of Joshua, we're going to see, from now till the end of November, we're going to see that they also faced barriers. Not once, not twice, but over and over and over again. They faced these barriers to accomplish the vision that God had given them. And we have to understand that that's going to be the case. Joshua is the hero of the book. Debate about whether he's the author, but he's the hero for sure. And when the Exodus took place, when the Israelites left Moses, he would have been just a young man. And it rose to be kind of Moses' right-hand man. He was an effective leader. He was very loyal to Moses. Remember when the 12 spies were sent out to go into the land and check it out, and can they take it? Do they have enough power? He was one of the ones, he and Caleb, that said, yes, we can do it. And unfortunately, the other 10 said, no way, we can't do that. We'll get killed. And so, needless to say, when Moses was dying, who did they think of to take over? It was Joshua. And that's kind of where the book of Joshua begins, is this point where he has taken over. They're now, again, right at the lip of the promised land, just about to go in again. Because remember, they had tried it before, and the people got scared and wouldn't go. Joshua is called a book of history. And for some of you, you just go history, and you get a blank stare, and you go, ugh, history. But it's not a book of dry, old history. It's probably one of the most exciting books in the Bible. A lot of action. And in fact, I thought when I was studying for this, that we should get somebody to make a gaming video of Joshua, because there's so much action going on. So it talks about these spiritual battles, and it talks about the geography, things that may not seem to make sense to us. But it also talks about how God worked in their lives and how he applied things to their lives, how he guided them, directed them, protected them in all of these things. And it reminds us in our lives, we face barriers. We have obstacles. I'm guessing some of you face some pretty significant obstacles this week. But what we see in the book of Joshua is that in the midst of those obstacles, God is there. Somebody said sometimes he calms the storm, and sometimes he calms us in the midst of the storm. And so even when we face those storms, we have to know that God is with us, protecting us. And so this is where the people are. Like I say, they're right on the edge of the promised land, but they know that their battles are not over. They still face the obstacles. One was right before them, the Jordan River. We're going to talk about that in a couple weeks. And one of the things that was ahead of them was actually Jordan itself. As you can see, Jordan is an incredibly difficult country geographically. Lots of hills, lots of mountains, lots of dry, arid places. And this is it. This is Jordan. This is what that. This is not Wascana Creek. And you walk across, and it's easy to because it's just flatness after that. No, not at all. It's difficult. So they don't have to face their own fears, their own doubts, their own apprehensions about attempting something that they hadn't been able to do before, but they face this kind of geography. And as we study this, over these next couple of months, I want us to give us an overall picture today of the book of Joshua. It's only 2 points, although lots of other points under it. 2 things that I want us to see about the book of Joshua. Possessing the land is not going to be easy. Again, I've said they already know that. This is not a group of trained soldiers that Joshua is leading. This is a nomadic tribe, a rebellious people. We've seen that over and over and over again. And they're coming against these well-defended city-states like Jericho, the first battle they're going to have. And so they have no training in fighting battles. They're sheep herders, a lot of them. And so I'm guessing that there was probably more than a little fear and doubt and anxiety in the camp. Again, we've tried it before. We're not soldiers. This is rough territory. All of these things. And they're on this side of the Jordan. They got to get to the other side. And I'm sure there was a lot of negative emotions there. And again, we still face these barriers today. The journey is often hard. I'm so thankful because sometimes I hear people give, I kind of heard a testimony driving in today, that basically you become a Christian and your life will be trouble-free. Didn't use exactly that phrase, but very, very close. Become a Christian and you'll have no more problems. Well, we know that's not true. If you've been a Christian more than a week and a half, you know that. And so we still have these things that we have to face. We go through, we don't face rough terrain or warriors of that type, but we face sin and habits. We face attitudes that continually crop up. Maybe we face addictions or relationships or financial challenges or job loss or divorce, all kinds of things. But Rosewood Park has obstacles that it has to go through too. Things that so many other churches have to. I shared last week about my brokenness at the church as a whole. Not Rosewood Park, but the church in Canada is not doing a job of reaching lost people for Jesus. And Rosewood Park faces that same thing. How do we do that? How do we reach people for Jesus? Do we have a strategy? How do we help our people? How do we help our members, our attenders, to grow in their faith? I never want to look back on December 31st and say I'm exactly the same person as I was on January 1st. And I don't think you do either. So how do we as a church, let me be blunt, really, a lot of it's up to you and God. But how do we as a church provide that environment for you to grow, to become more conformed to the image of Christ? How do we progress in this search for a new lead pastor? How do we understand the times? How do we respond to the times? I don't know about you, but I'm so confused sometimes about how do we reach lost people in the time that we live in today. So, 2 things that we learn in our book. of Joshua. First of all, we are encouraged by God's plan. When you read this book, you cannot help, in my opinion, you cannot help but be encouraged by God's plan. And one of the reasons for that is that as we look at God's plan, then we see his promises. Over and over and over again, Joshua teaches his people that God keeps his promises. And in Exodus 6:4, God had promised the land to Moses. He said that land is going to be Israel's land. It was a promise, and so he knew that it was going to happen. But through Moses' own disobedience, and through the disobedience of the Israelites, Moses did not enter in. See, he got right there. God took him up to a high place, showed him around, said, this is what sadly you're not going to see or not going to enter. And so he never did get there. But Joshua and the people of Israel that were there then are about to see the fulfillment of the promise. And he's going to lead those people in. And really, the whole book of Joshua can, I guess, be summarized in God leading his people. And that's what the whole book is, over and over and over again. Leading them from victory to victory. And in the midst of that, helping them learn from their defeats. Because there were defeats, but they weren't because of God. There were things that they did and didn't do that created their defeats. And God helped them to learn through those. And so we see God leading his people, protecting them. And this is why in chapter 23, verse 1, when it says that Joshua was well advanced in years. Well advanced in years. And he didn't become leader till he was 70. So who knows how old he was by then. It says he could say, when he's well advanced in years, could say this in chapter 23, verse 14. You know, speaking to the people, you know with all your heart and soul that not one. Isn't that amazing? That not one of all the good promises the Lord your God gave you has failed. Every promise has been fulfilled. Not one has failed. And so we can't help but be encouraged by God's promises, just like the people of Israel were. But in God's plan, we also see his will. Joshua emphasizes that God wanted to take his people, to take full possession of the land. The sad part is that oftentimes it didn't happen because of the people themselves. It's what God wanted for them. But the people themselves rebelled or allowed fear to control them or whatever. They seemed to be the ones that were reluctant to see God's will be done. They didn't want to take risks. They didn't want to step out in faith. They didn't want to leave their comfort zones. They were afraid to enter 40 years before. And even once they finally entered the promised land, Joshua shows that they never did completely fulfill God's will. And so we see God's will. Do we do God's will? That's the key. In chapter 18, verse 3, Joshua said to the Israelites, how long will you wait before you begin to take possession of the land that the Lord, the God of your fathers, has given you? Do you get that? How long are you going to wait to take possession of the land that God has given you? In other words, it's already theirs. All they have to do is act on God's will and to do it. And there may be things in your life that God has given you, but you need to step out in his will and move toward it and to take it. And so we see his promises and we see his will, but we also see his goodness. Joshua describes the generosity of God in giving the land to his people and giving the victories in the battles. They still had to fight the battles as we do. Again, the Christian life is not, a rose garden. We have the battles and we have to fight the battles. And he was telling them that. But the result was already determined. The result was already determined as long as they would fight those battles. He gave these lands generously. He gave gifts generously to his people as they entered and they began to take the land. And as we talked about last week, God has given us gifts today. He just wants us to use them, as we said last week again. You don't want them on the shelf. We want to use them. And so we see his promises, we see his will, we see his goodness. And finally, we see his power. The power of God. That God was more powerful than any of the armies that came against them. And beloved, God is more powerful than anything that you will ever face. Now, I know when you're in the midst of it, you're afraid, you're uncertain, you're confused, you're doubting, but stand on this promise that God is more powerful than any army that you will ever face, any problem that you will face, any issue that you will ever face. God is bigger than that. We see that he even controls nature. In Joshua 10:12, he makes the sun stand still for one day so they can continue to fight the battle. He makes the sun stand still. I couldn't even make my own sun, S-O-N, stand still. But he made the sun stand still. He is the God of power. He's greater than our disobedience. He's greater than our disobedience. He can help us to turn that around and to repent. He's bigger than people's deception. He can overcome people's lack of passion and commitment. We see him work miracle after miracle. We see his power in the book of Joshua, and we're going to see this over and over and over again in this book. It's probably one of my favorite books of the Old Testament. And part of it is just because of this, because of how we see God work. And the faith, the confidence, the trust that we can build from seeing that. But we don't just see, not just encouraged by God's plan, but we are challenged as God's people. First of all, we see that God challenges his people to be people of purpose. We have to possess the land that God gave to us. What is the purpose of your life? I'm amazed how many people I ask that and they don't really have one. I want to be a good father, a good mother. Wonderful, wonderful things to be. But one day, your children grow up. So what's your purpose then? What is the purpose of your life? Do you have one? The purpose of my life is to help people grow in Christ, beginning with my family and my church and my community. That's the purpose of my life. It's why I live. This is what I love to do. I want to see people grow in Christ. Secondly, God challenges his people to be people of obedience. Oh, that we would learn this in today's culture. That we'd be people of obedience. And he calls us to obey completely. It's not conditional. When I first became a Christian, I would ask God if I was sensing that he was asking me to do something. I'd say, oh, God, tell me what that's going to look like before I say yes. I want to know the consequences. I want to know what's going to happen next. And I would actually say that. And then I realized it's not what God is calling me to do. God is calling me to obedience. God challenges his people to be people of faith. Now, I know that none of you struggle with this. I do. I struggle with faith. I struggle with believing that God will come through. Do you know how many times God has come through in my life in the last 42 years? I can't even count them. But you know what? This time God might not. I'm facing something and I say, nope, God might not come through this time. And I totally lack faith when there's no reason to lack faith because I've seen him work here and here and here and here and here. God has never, ever let me down. I've let God down many times. So begin to pray, beloved. Fill me with faith. Help me to be a man or a woman or a youth or a child of faith. To step out. God challenges his people to be people of holiness. Probably one of the most disappointing things I see in our churches today, to be honest with you. I'm probably gone pretty soon, so I'll say some things. Is that we don't seem to walk in holiness much anymore. We don't seem to be concerned about it. I think God is calling us to be people without compromise. That we will deal with the sin that we see in our own life. That we will deal with the sin that we see in our own life. We're not going to compromise with our enemies. We're committed to live lives of holiness. And then finally, God challenges his people to be people of perseverance. I've already said a couple times, it's not easy to be a Christian today. Maybe it never has been. So we need to persevere and to say, I'm just moving forward. I'm not stopping God. I'm not going to allow these obstacles in front of me to stop me from moving on. I will persevere. I will keep on going. I will be committed. A number of years ago, the late Steve Jobs, it was the first time that he was the head of Apple, and he was trying to recruit John Scully, who was the president of Pepsi-Cola. He was trying to recruit him to come to Apple. And he met with him several times, and Scully said no every time. And finally, in their last meeting, they're talking away, and Scully's saying, I told you before, Steve, I'm not coming. And Jobs slammed his hand on the table like this. And he said, in one word, I won't repeat. He said, John, do you want to spend the rest of your life selling sugared water, or do you want a chance to change our world? Do you want to sell sugared water for the rest of your life, or do you want a chance to change our world? The challenge to Rosewood Park Alliance Church. The challenge to all of us who are part of Rosewood Church. Do we want to just play it safe? I'm 70 years old. I don't know how long I'm going to live. I don't want to play it safe for the rest of my life. Do we want to play it safe? Do we want to stay on this side of the Jordan? Do we want to stay safe? Do we want to stay comfortable? To do things the way that we've always done them? Are we willing to step out in faith? Are we willing to say, I will take risks. I will step out of my comfort zone? Are we willing to trust him? Are we willing to see him glorified? Do we want the chance? Oh, please tell me you do. Do we want the chance to see God work miracles in us and through us as we step out of our comfort zone and say, God, I'm walking on thin ice. I need you to guide me. Thank you so much, Father, for your book of Joshua that gives us so much direction and help. Give us the ability, Lord, to live what we're going to read and study over these next several weeks. And we give you thanks in the precious name of Christ. Amen.